Hey there, Twisters, and welcome, hockey fans. It's the start of the 2024 Stanley Cup playoffs, my favorite time of year. And for this video, I decided to go through each NHL team's history and talk about their Stanley Cup drought, whether they won the Stanley Cup recently or have been waiting for over 50 years. So that's what we get in this video. We're going to particularly pay attention to teams that are in the 2024 playoffs. If you're following the playoffs, I welcome you to join our bracket challenge through NHL.com. It's totally free to join, so see a link to that in the pinned comment. We've already got several dozen Twisters signed up for that. We even have a special one for our Discord server, which again, you can join by seeing the link in the pinned comment down below and in the video description. All right, let's kick this off. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll get started with the Toronto Maple Leafs. So we start with the longest Stanley Cup drought, and that belongs to the Toronto Maple Leafs, dating all the way back to 1967. That was their 13th cup in franchise history and the 4th that decade, and that was the last Stanley Cup awarded in the original 6 era. Now the Leafs haven't even made it to the Stanley Cup final since then. They've had a couple of deep runs, including in 1978 when they got all the way to the semifinals. Then in 1993, they won 2 Game 7s to get to the conference final. However, in Game 6 of the conference final against the LA Kings, official Kerry Fraser missed a high sticking call on Wayne Gretzky, and then Gretzky would score the overtime winning goal to force Game 7. The Kings would go on to win. The next year, the Leafs went to the conference final again, but they fell to the Cinderella Vancouver Canucks in overtime of Game 5 on a goal from Greg Adams, and the Leafs also went 19 years without winning a playoff round, and they've had some bad collapses in more recent years, but of course they were able to get off the schneid this past year with a victory against the Lightning. Our next two teams haven't even won the Stanley Cup, and they both came into the NHL the same year. The first team is also in the playoffs, and that's the Vancouver Canucks. They were founded in 1970. They've had 3 runs to the final. In 1982, they actually had a losing record, and they had lost only 2 of their first 13 playoff games, but then they met the dynasty New York Islanders team and were swept. 12 years later, they had just 85 points, but went on a magical run back to the final, led by Captain Canuck Trevor Linden, Kirk McLean in goal, and of course the electric Pavel Bure, but they lost in 7 games versus a better New York Rangers team. They also went to the Stanley Cup final in 2011, winning the President's Trophy with 117 points. They slayed the Dragon against the defending champion Blackhawks in what was a great rivalry in that decade, and in the Stanley Cup final versus the Bruins, they won the first 2 games by a narrow margin, but Tim Thomas had a .967 save percentage in that series, and the Canucks were embarrassed on home ice in Game 7, and subsequently riots erupted in Vancouver. The Canucks won the President's Trophy the next year, but they were bounced in the first round by the would-be champion LA Kings, and between 2016 and 2023, they've gone to the playoffs just once. The other team that hasn't won a cup and won't be in the playoffs this year is the Buffalo Sabres. They've been to the finals twice in 1975 and 1999. They had that great French Connection line in the 70s, and in the 1990s they had one of the best goaltenders of all time, Dominik Hasek, who won the MVP 2 times. But unfortunately they came up short, of course in heartbreaking fashion, with the Brett Hull goal in triple overtime in 1999 Game 6, and they haven't made the playoffs since 2011. Now let's talk about the Philadelphia Flyers. They barely missed the playoffs this year. They last won the Stanley Cup in 1975. That was the second of a back-to-back with, of course, the Broad Street Bullies. They were the first non-original 6 team to win it all, but ever since then, they seemingly have to run into a dynasty every time they make a deep run and get into the final. They had the best record in 1980, but they lost to the underdog New York Islanders, who would forge a dynasty. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Then, 5 years later, they had the best record once again. They lost in 5 games to an Edmonton Oilers dynasty in the making. 2 years later, they met the Oilers once again, but they lost in 7 games. And then in 97, they were the favorite heading into the Cup final, but they were swept by the Red Wings, but Detroit was pretty stacked. And then in 2010, they actually had a pretty magical run. They weren't expected to be anywhere near the final. They completed just the 3rd reverse sweep in a best-of-7 series, but they lost in 6 games in overtime to Patrick Kane and the Chicago Blackhawks, who would have a dynasty of their own in the 2010s. Now let's get to those Islanders. They last won the Stanley Cup in '83. That was their 4th Stanley Cup. They won them all in a row. They're back in the playoffs this year. So with that dynasty, of course, they had legends like Brian Trottier, Mike Bossy, Denny Potvin, and Billy Smith, among others. They convincingly swept Wayne Gretzky's Oilers, holding the NHL's best offense to just 6 goals. But then the following year, the Oilers returned the favor against the Islanders in 5 games, holding New York to just 12 goals. Flash forward to '93, and even though the Islanders had just 87 points, they went to the conference finals. They triumphed in 7 games over the powerhouse back-to-back champion Pittsburgh Penguins, who had entered the postseason on a 17-game winning streak, winning goal from David Volek, but they fell in 5 games to the would-be would-be champion Montreal Canadiens. After that, the Isles went 23 years without winning a playoff series, but then shortly after, Barry Trotz comes in from the Cup-winning Capitals. They make deep runs into the conference final in 2020 and 2021 with great defense and outstanding goaltending, but they run into the back-to-back champion Tampa Bay Lightning. The first time around, the Islanders lose in 6 games on an overtime goal from Anthony Cirelli, and the next year they fall 1-0 in Game 7, the lone goal coming from Yanni Gourde. Our next team is the Calgary Flames. They've won 1 Stanley Cup in 1989. There's only been one other time where they've been back to the conference final or the Stanley Cup final. That came in 2004 with Jarome Iginla and Mika Kiprusoff. They got all the way to Game 6 and Martin Jelena had a redirect that was called a no goal, and then they lost in overtime and eventually fell in Game 7 to the Tampa Bay Lightning. The next team is in the playoffs, and that's the Edmonton Oilers. They were last a Stanley Cup champion in 1990. That was the 5th of their franchise, but this one came without Wayne Gretzky. He was on the Kings by then. And since then, they went back to the final in 2006. It was a magical run. They were the lowest seeded team in the playoffs in the Western Conference. And even though they lost in Game 7 in the final against the Hurricanes, without Dwayne Rollison for a lot of that, it's still a very magical run. However, they went through a huge playoff drought for 10 years from 2007 until 2017. But of course, along the way, they were able to draft some of their core right now, including Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Leon Draisaitl, and then of course Connor McDavid. That core advanced to the conference final in 2022 where they were swept by the Avalanche, but that was their furthest run in 18 years. We'll quickly go over the next 3 teams. So we start with my team, the San Jose Sharks. They've been around since 1991. They've been to the final just one time. That came in 2016. They fell in 6 games to the Pittsburgh Penguins. From 2004 to 2019, the Sharks missed the playoffs only one time, but yet they only went to the final once, and they haven't made the playoffs since then. The next team entered the NHL the next year, and that was the Ottawa Senators. We're not going to count the original Senators from the 1920s. But in 2007, they got to the Stanley Cup final. They lost to a superior Anaheim Ducks team in 5 games. That said, they had a very exciting core that would perennially make the playoffs with Daniel Alfredsson, Danny Heatley, and Jason Spezza, among others. They got back to the conference final in 2017, but in Game 7, in double overtime, they lost to Chris Kunitz and the Pittsburgh Penguins. And since then, the Ottawa Senators have not made the playoffs. Now we get to the oldest club here, the Montreal Canadiens. Their last Stanley Cup came in 1993, and that was their 24th Stanley Cup. This is currently their longest Stanley Cup drought in franchise history. The previous record for them was only 13 years. They went to the conference final in 2010 and 2014, and then in 2021, they went on an absolutely improbable run with just a 24, 21, and 11 record. Ultimately, they fell to the Tampa Bay Lightning in 5 games. Our next team was in the final this past year, and that's the Florida Panthers. They've been around since 1993, and they've been to the finals a total of twice. So in just their 3rd year, they went to the final on a magical run. They had 92 points that year. On paper, though, the Avalanche were a much more stacked team, and so the Panthers were swept, going down in triple overtime in Game 4 on a goal from the Avalanche's Uwe Krupp. Just 2 years ago, they won the President's Trophy with 122 points, largely with the interim coach at that time, Andrew Brunette. They won their first playoff round since 1996, but they were swept the next round by the defending champion Lightning. In the offseason, they pulled off one of the biggest trades of our time by moving Jonathan Huberdeau and Mackenzie Weegar to the Flames in exchange for Matthew Tkachuk. They also replaced Brunette with now head coach Paul Maurice. They made it into the playoffs last year as a wild card. They battled back from 3-1 in their series against the record-setting Boston Bruins, and they got all the way to the final with a red-hot Sergei Bobrovsky in goal, but they fell to the Vegas Golden Knights in 5 games. Next up, we've got the New York Rangers. They last won the Stanley Cup back in 1994. That was their first since 1940, so this drought isn't quite as long. It was the 4th cup in their franchise's history. They had actually won the President's Trophy that year, and they won 2 Game 7s on that run, including in the conference final against the New Jersey Devils with Stéphane Matteau's double OT winner, and then Marc Messier scored what would be the game-winning goal against the Vancouver Canucks at home in Game 7 of the final. Since then, the Rangers made it back to the final in 2014. They lost 3 of their 4 games in overtime or later against the LA Kings, and even though Henrik Lundqvist battled his butt off out there, Jonathan Quick was playoff Jonathan Quick, and that's pretty unbeatable. The Rangers also won the President's Trophy the next year, but they lost in the conference final to the Tampa Bay Lightning. They were shut out in Game 7, 2-0 by Ben Bishop and the Bolts. Our next team is the Arizona Coyotes. They've been around since 1996, but if you want to take that back to when they were the original Winnipeg Jets, that's 1979. They've never made the Stanley Cup final. The furthest they've gone is the conference final one time back in 2012. They won their first 2 playoff series in Arizona, but they fell in 5 games to the would-be champion LA Kings, and they've only gone to the playoffs 1 time since then. This next team is almost perennially in the playoffs. That's the Nashville Predators. They've been around since 1998. They've made the playoffs in 16 of their last 20 years. They went to the final one time in 2017, and that was as a wild card, but they fell to the defending champion Penguins in 6 games. They actually lost Game 6 with under 2 minutes left. The next year, they killed it in the regular season by winning the President's Trophy with 117 points, but they lost to the Winnipeg Jets in the second round. Now, much of that core is gone, but they never had to tear down all that much to remain competitive. And they've done that by parting ways with players before it's too late. They almost always have amazing goaltending, and of course, that exchange between David Poile and Barry Trotz as the new general manager, hiring Andrew Brunette, bringing in Ryan O'Reilly, and just building a good winning culture for that environment there in Nashville. That's why they're back in the playoffs this year. For the next team, we've got the Dallas Stars. They last won the Stanley Cup in 1999, the lone time they've done that. If you like goaltending duels, the Stars would definitely be a team to watch in that era. We had, of course, Ed Belfour versus Dominik Hasek. There was that controversial skate in the crease goal by Brett Hull in triple overtime of Game 6, and that year, the Stars had actually won the President's Trophy with 114 points. The next year, they returned back to the Stanley Cup final after winning in triple overtime of Game 5. They lost in double overtime of Game 6 on a goal from Jason Arnott. Again, another great goaltending duel between Ed Belfour and Martin Brodeur. And then they went to the Stanley Cup final 20 years later. In the second round against the Avalanche, they won in Game 7 in overtime on a goal from Yoel Kiviranta. And then with Ben Bishop injured in goal, Anton Khudobin stepped in and played fantastic, but yet the Stars fell in 6 games to the Lightning. Now let's quickly go to the Minnesota Wild. They've been around since 2000. They've never made the Stanley Cup final. They did have a magical run back in 2003, getting to the conference final and winning 2 Game 7s in order to get there, but they haven't won a playoff round since 2015. Another team that came into the NHL at that time is the Columbus Blue Jackets. They've been to the playoffs just 6 times, and they've only won 2 rounds. However, one of them was historic in 2019 against the record-tying Tampa Bay Lightning. They had won 62 games to tie that record. Now, the Blue Jackets in Game 1 were down 3-0 heading into first intermission, but they never looked back and they actually swept the Lightning for one of the greatest upsets in all of sports in North America. Now we go to the New Jersey Devils. They last won the Stanley Cup in 2003. That was their 3rd in franchise history. And of course, they had that amazing defense and goaltending from the likes of Scott Stevens, Scott Niedermayer, Martin Brodeur, among others. They went back to the final in 2012 in what was Peter DeBoer's first year as head coach. They beat the Panthers in double overtime of Game 7 in round 1, but they fell in 6 games to the LA Kings in the final, and they scored just 6 goals in that span. And since then, the Devils have only been to the playoffs 2 times. Our next team is back in the playoffs for the 6th straight year, and that is the Carolina Hurricanes. They won their lone Stanley Cup in 2006, and that also counts their time in Hartford. They had 112 points that year and won their division, and they won 2 Game 7s to get there in the conference final against the Buffalo Sabres, and as mentioned earlier, in Game 7 of the final against the upstart Edmonton Oilers. They haven't been back to the final since then, but they've been to the conference final 3 times. However, they've actually been swept each time, and that includes 2 trips with current head coach Rod Brind'Amour against the Boston Bruins, his first year in Carolina, and as you might know, last year against the Florida Panthers. Our next team is the Anaheim Ducks. They won their lone Stanley Cup in 2007 with a great core consisting of Teemu Selanne, Scott and Rob Niedermayer, Chris Pronger, Jean-Sebastien Giguère in goal, and of course you had Perry and Getzlaf early in their careers. Since then, they've been to the conference final 2 times. In 2015, they lost in 7 games to the would-be champion Chicago Blackhawks, and then 2 years after that, they lost in 6 games to the Nashville Predators, and they haven't gone back to the playoffs since 2018. We've got a couple more original 6 teams here, so one of them is the Detroit Red Wings. They last won the Stanley Cup back in 2008. That was their 11th cup in franchise history. They just missed the playoffs this year. In 2008, they beat the Pittsburgh Penguins in 6 games, but the following year, Pittsburgh got revenge and defeated the Red Wings in 7 games, Sidney Crosby becoming the youngest captain to ever win the Stanley Cup. Since then, the furthest the Wings have advanced is just the 2nd round, and the last time they were in the playoffs was back in 2016. Let's go to another original 6 team, and that is the Boston Bruins. They won their 6th Stanley Cup back in 2011. Now, they actually won 3 Game 7s to get there in overtime against the Canadiens in the first round. And the same guy who scored that goal, Nathan Horton, would actually score the lone goal in Game 7 against the Lightning in the conference final. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, they won Game 7 of the final 4-0 in Vancouver. The Bruins have had a combination of deep runs and also disappointing finishes since then. So in 2013, they got back to the Stanley Cup final, but they fell in 6 to the Blackhawks. The next year, they won the President's Trophy, but they lost to the Canadiens in the second round. They got back to the Stanley Cup final in 2019, but they lost in 7 on home ice to the St. Louis Blues. The next year, they won the President's Trophy, but they lost in the second round to the Lightning, who would win the Stanley Cup. And then in 2023, as we know, historic season, winning the President's Trophy, but they were bounced in Game 7 against the Panthers. Now we go to the Winnipeg Jets. So the current version of the Winnipeg Jets has been around since 2011-12. Their franchise started in Atlanta in 1999, and we'll also briefly touch on the original Winnipeg Jets from 1979 to 96. They only won 2 playoff series against the Calgary Flames, and both times after that they were swept by the eventual champion, the Edmonton Oilers. Now the new Winnipeg Jets, first of all beginning in Atlanta in 1999, only went to the playoffs one time. They were swept by the Rangers. So since 2011-12 in Winnipeg, the furthest they've advanced is the conference final in 2018. They knocked off the President's Trophy winning Predators and also the Wild to get there, but they fell in 5 games to the Vegas Golden Knights in their first season. But they still have a similar core of players that have been the backbone to this team succeeding pretty much year over year, at least in terms of getting back into the postseason. Connor Hellebuck in goal, Josh Morrissey on defense, and of course Kyle Connor, Nikolai Ehlers, and Mark Scheifele as their forwards. Now, the remaining teams here aren't necessarily in a huge drought per se, but I had to touch on all of them nonetheless. So we start with the LA Kings. Their last Stanley Cup came in 2014, so we're looking at a 10-year gap here. Now, they went on unexpected runs in both championships in 2012 and 14, and then in 2014, they won 3 Game 7s just to get into the final. First of all, they completed the reverse sweep against my San Jose Sharks. Then they knocked off another California rival, the Ducks, in a Game 7, and against the Blackhawks in the conference final, Alec Martinez scored the winning goal in overtime of Game 7. By the way, the Hawks were the defending champion. And then in double overtime of Game 5 against the Rangers in the final, it's Martinez once again. But since then, the Kings have been back to the playoffs 4 times, and they haven't won a round just yet. So can they get one more with that core still remaining of Anze Kopitar and Drew Doughty? The next team is the Blackhawks. They had a bit of a dynasty there in the early 2010s, so they won their 6th cup in franchise history back in 2015. That was their 3rd in the past 6 seasons. But despite winning a qualifying round against the Oilers in the 2020 bubble playoffs, they haven't won a best of 7 series since 2015. Let's talk about another great franchise in the 2010s. That's the Pittsburgh Penguins. They won their 5th Stanley Cup in 2017, and they narrowly missed the playoffs this year. So they were back-to-back champions in 2016 and 17, defeating the Sharks and Predators. Then they lost the next year in the second round to the would-be champion Capitals, and they haven't won a playoff series since then. Let's touch on those 2018 Washington Capitals. That was the first cup in their franchise's history. After 44 years, they shed this label of being a perennial letdown in the postseason. They missed the playoffs last year, but they're back in this year. Now, Washington is actually seeking their first playoff series win since the cup year. The guys who are still left over from that team, Nicholas Backstrom sat out this year, but technically he's still a Cap. And then you have, of course, the great 8 Alex Ovechkin, John Carlson, Tom Wilson, and TJ Oshie. They're actually on their 3rd head coach since their Stanley Cup run because Barry Trotz walked to the Islanders. So first you had Todd Reirden, then you had Peter Laviolette. They're actually facing him in the first round this year. And now they have Spencer Carberry in his first year. And then we can quickly buzz through these remaining teams here. So we've got the St. Louis Blues. They won the first cup in franchise history 52 years after their founding in 2019. They won in double overtime of Game 7 against the Stars in round 2, and then they won in Boston for Game 7 of the final. But since then, they've won only 1 playoff series. The Tampa Bay Lightning won their 3rd Stanley Cup in 2021. That completed back-to-back cup runs, also 2020. They reached the final again in 2022, coming back from down 3-1 in their series against the Maple Leafs and from down 2-0 against the Rangers in the conference final, but they fell to the Colorado Avalanche in 6 games in the final. The Seattle Kraken have been around since 2021. They've been to the playoffs 1 time, and they actually upset the defending champion Avalanche in the first round in 7 games, and they pushed the Dallas Stars to 7 games in the second round, but ultimately lost. I just mentioned the Avalanche here, so their last cup came in 2022. That was the 3rd cup in franchise history, and that includes their time in Quebec as the Nordiques. Overall, a pretty dominant run from the Avs. They went 16-4 in the playoffs, so we're wondering if they can get another one with their core, even without Gabriel Landeskog this year. And lastly, of course, we have the defending champion Golden Knights, so really there's no drought here. That's the first cup in their franchise history. Again, a fairly dominant run. They went 16-6. Adin Hill went beast mode in goal. They appeared in the final back in 2018, their first season in franchise history. They ultimately lost to the Washington Capitals in the final. All right, Twisters, well, which playoff team do you want to see break its Stanley Cup drought here in 2024? Let me know in the comments below, and stick around for more coverage, including videos and live streams throughout the Stanley Cup playoffs. You can also keep up with me in the meantime on social media. Just see the video description for more links to that, and feel free to shout out any other topics you'd like me to cover, whether now or in the offseason. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'm Nick, and I'll see you around for the playoffs. Ciao.